this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Get almost anything you need delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get chicken parmesan delivered. A little escape? No. A delicious bowl of grapes? Yes, that. An afternoon stroll? Sorry, no. A burrito bowl? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
Nationwide is so much more than a great insurance company. They're one of America's largest financial services companies. Like how I'm more than just Peyton Manning. I'm also motivating Manning. When I say insurance, you say financial services. Insurance. Financial services. Insurance. Financial services. Now when I say nationwide, you say is both. Nationwide. Is both. Nationwide. Is both. For your insurance and financial needs, Nationwide is on your side.
Nationwide Investment Services Corporation, member FINRA, Columbus, Ohio.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1072 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show wasn't that terrible. It was honestly the best quarterback week of the season. In terms of standard fantasy points, Brock Purdy had 26, Jackson Dart 22, Trevor Lawrence 44, CJ Stroud 23, and JJ McCarthy 24. Even Aaron Rodgers was usable. It doesn't get much better than that. Tight end was pretty good too. Harold Fannin had 12 PPR points, Dalton Schultz scored almost 22, and Darren Waller posted almost 26. And Chicago's defense, great streaming choice. So the onesie positions were great. The running backs and wide receivers, not so much. On the flip side, Chuba Hubbard, Kyle Monangai, Chimere DK, Andre Yosivash, and my preferred choice of Devin Singletary over Tyrone Tracy were all misses. Tajay Spears didn't get a ton of work either, and a plus matchup for his receiving skill set. And then San Francisco, that defense that he faced, and Dallas, they were bad streaming defenses. It was hit or miss as usual, but there were some big hits in there. This is actually the last week for this Sleeper Show because of the holiday, so I'm looking to finish strong. I'll still have all my rankings and such next week on Patreon, but for this show, this is the last one. Let's end things on a high note. We'll kick things off by looking at players rostered in 50 to 80% of Yahoo leagues, and somehow, Jacoby Brissett, maybe because he faced the Texans last week, he's 66% rostered right now, despite the fact that he's quite literally finished as a top 12 quarterback every single start of this season. Not only is Brissett a good play because of that, but he gets a Falcons team that ranks 15th, middle of the road in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. Atlanta's also been worse against quarterbacks of late, having given up 15 or more standard fantasy points in 7 of their last 8. So Brissett's a strong option. CJ Stroud's another one. I do worry about the Texans leaning on the run in this game against Vegas, but Houston, they have a really good 26-point implied team total. Stroud's coming off a game that had a similar potential game script, and he posted 23 fantasy points. I'm not in love with him this week, but I do think that team total can carry him. At running back, I'm going to start with Chuba Hubbard. I know Rico Dowdle was sort of the more obvious selection for the Panthers backfield last week, and Hubbard ended up with just 8 carries and 1 target. But Chuba still played 43% of Carolina's snaps. He had a 45% route share. He's been playing their long down and distance snaps. Now, I'd anticipate a little bit more passing from Carolina in this game against Tampa Bay. That probably favors Chuba a little bit more than Rico Dowdle. Not that I would play him over Dowdle straight up. But teams against Tampa Bay generally see their pass rates increase by 5 percentage points. And the Bucs have just been bad defensively. We saw that last week against Atlanta. They now rank 11th worst in adjusted points allowed to running backs. I wouldn't love to rely on Hubbard, but as a sleeper, I can see a path. Jordan Mason's a little bit of a deeper play, but just like Chuba Hubbard, I can see a path with Mason too. Don't expect volume through the air, but Mason's seen 11 and 10 rush attempts over his last 2 games. Now the Vikings get the Giants, and they're sitting as favorites, which means there's a chance they get ahead in that game, and they rely on their bruiser. And the Giants are the second best matchup for running backs this year by adjusted points allowed. They've allowed 30 rushing yards per game this year over expected to running backs. That's the second highest mark in the league. So like Hubbard, I prefer Mason's backfield teammate Aaron Jones, but there's at least some potential here. Kamani Vidal is playing more snaps than Amari and Hampton. And while Hampton did get more work on the ground than him last week, Vidal still saw a 44% running back rush share. The Chargers get the Cowboys this week, and yes, Dallas has been better against the run since trading for Quinnen Williams. But Williams is also in concussion protocol. I think even if he goes, it's a pretty high-scoring environment where Vidal's going to find the field, especially if there's a trailing game script, because they trust him more in pass pro. So I think he's an okay play if you're desperate. Kenneth Gainwell is the last running back in this tier to call out, and I don't love this matchup against Detroit. They're the third worst matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed, and within this game, what's kind of interesting, Detroit's fourth lowest in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh ranks second in the NFL in running back target share. So the matchup is not good on paper. But Gainwell has now had an RB1 performance in PPR leagues in 4 of his last 5 games, for real. He's averaging a target share per game rate of almost 22% over his last 5. That kind of usage, especially in PPR formats, it's just hard to ignore. At wide receiver, I don't mind Jordan Addison. The Giants are a top half matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed, and while Addison only saw 2 targets last week in an awesome matchup, he did see target shares of 35% and 30% the 2 weeks prior. There's definitely volatility here, but that's to be expected at this point with these non-elite wide receivers. The matchup is at least strong, and we've seen him with high target share games. The matchup that Addison couldn't take advantage of last week, Dallas, that's one that Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston, they're going to get this week. Now, obviously, if Johnston can't go again, then I'd be in on Allen. I think Allen is fine regardless. He's seen target shares of 25%, 24%, 13%, and 27% over his last 4 games. He does take a decent hit if QJ is back, because QJ will push Allen more into the slot. This past week, Allen only played 25% of his snaps from the slot. That was a season low. In Dallas, they've been bad against perimeter wide receivers. They're the best matchup on paper for wide receivers, and that's why these guys should be on your radar. At tight end in this tier, Jawan Johnson could be a decent play. Devon Vele's banged up. He's already ruled out for this week. That makes Johnson an even better play than usual. The Saints get a beatable Jets defense that's been average against tight ends by adjusted points allowed, and Johnson's averaged a 19% target share per game rate over his last 8. With a reasonable 22.5 point total, for the Saints that is, I think Jawan Johnson's fine. I don't love him, but you could definitely do worse. And then I'm also going to go back to Harold Fannin. I've already gotten a ton of questions about Fannin this week, and my general vibe is that you should probably play him. He had a 45% target share last week. That was the highest of any tight end this season. With Shedeur Sanders under center, Fannin has a target share per game rate of 32%. He scored double-digit PPR points in each of his last 3. Now, the reason why people are asking me questions is because on paper, this is the toughest matchup for tight ends. They get Buffalo. In Cleveland, they only have a 16-point implied team total. I know matchups matter, and that's a big focus of this show, but they're not everything. That's why I always lead with volume. We want volume first and foremost, and Harold Fannin, he's getting that volume. And then another tight end that I'm getting tons of questions about, for obvious reasons, is Darren Waller. He definitely takes a hit with Tua being benched, but it's hard to deny this matchup. This is sort of the opposite of what I just talked about with Harold Fannin. We have unknown usage with Darren Waller, though he did have a 31% target share last week. But man, this matchup, amazing. Cincinnati was good against Ravens tight ends last week, but they still are giving up 9 PPR points per game above expected to opposing team tight ends. The next closest team is Pittsburgh, who are 4.3 points per game above expected. I still think Waller's in play, just not as like a mid-range tight end 1 like he was with Tua. Right now, he's probably more high-end tight end 2 territory. The next group of players consists of guys rostered in fewer than 50% of leagues, so naturally, there's going to be more players to call out here. At quarterback, I've got a handful of guys for you. First is JJ McCarthy. I don't think you need to totally force it this week, but the Giants are a top 10 matchup by adjusted points allowed, and I'd say McCarthy has looked more competent over the last couple of weeks in a plus matchup. Both of them were plus matchups. And he's produced his 2 best EPA per dropback games in those matchups. And Minnesota has a reasonable 23-point implied team total. So that's one streamer for you. Next is Aaron Rodgers. The Steelers are likely going to have to keep pace against Detroit this week, and the Lions, they've been a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks this year by adjusted points allowed. They've also given up 19 passing yards over expected per game to quarterbacks. Now, Like I said with this matchup, I don't really love it for the Steelers offense because they target their running backs so much, and Detroit, they're generally good at limiting that. But I do think that Rodgers is still a deeper or a super flex play this week. Bryce Young is someone that I actually do like. Tampa Bay is kind of a pass funnel defense where teams against them see their pass rate rise by 5 percentage points. And the Bucs have played well above expected when limiting running back rushing yards, but they've allowed almost 30 passing yards per game over expected to quarterbacks, meaning we should expect Bryce Young to have 30 more passing yards than normal. And that's just an average. The Panthers don't have the most amazing team total this week, but I do think they're going to have to toss it around more than usual. That could result in more points for Bryce Young. Tyler Shuck has been getting it done lately. I mean, for how people think about Tyler Shuck. He scored 17, 21, and 18 standard fantasy points over his last 3. New Orleans, they have a decent enough implied team total this week. And the Jets, their opponent, they ranked 7th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks this year. We've seen Shuck offer up some rushing upside too. And I wonder if we could see that even more with Devin Neal sidelined. So I don't mind him as a deep play. And then lastly, I'm buying more and more into Kirk Cousins this week. I probably wouldn't play Cousins without Drake London, or at least I wouldn't be as confident. But if London is back this week, the Falcons get a Cardinals team that's given up a top 10 fantasy performance in 4 of their last 5 games. This game is in a dome, and Atlanta surprisingly has a 25-point implied team total. So again, if Drake London is back, I think Cousins really works. Even if he doesn't play, you might still be able to play Cousins. Moving on to running back, I've got to just throw it out there to monitor all of the injuries right now. I don't have all the proper information to talk about certain guys, but you can reference the 15 transaction show to know who those players are. And then I'll add them to the sleepers list if the starter's officially out. So those players like Jawar Jordan, Malik Davis, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Michael Carter is not really one of those players because he should just be on your radar, like I talked about on the 15 transaction show. Now, I think Amari DiMercado is going to see more work in that backfield than he did last week, but Carter did come away with a 78% running back rush share. And the last time we saw Carter and DiMercado kind of in the same situation, Carter walked away with a 72% running back rush share and a 17% target share. DiMercado has seen more than 42% of the team's running back rushes in just 1 game this year. Now, obviously, the coaching staff, they can do whatever they want. But to me, all of the signs are pointing towards Michael Carter. And the Cardinals, they get a pretty advantageous matchup against the Falcons this week. That's a team that's been struggling defensively over the second half of the season. They're an above average matchup for running backs right now by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Samaje Perine is kind of an interesting deep play this week. There's a decent chance the Bengals play with a nice script because they're now facing Quinn Ewers. Perine has actually seen attempt totals of 14, 6, and 14 over their last 3 games. He had a 52% running back rush share last week. Miami's become an average opponent for running backs by adjusted points allowed, but they're an above average opponent in adjusted rushing yards allowed to running backs. I could see a scenario where game script allowed Samaje Perine to get a decent amount of work. I mean, he's already been seeing a decent amount of work. There really aren't that many running backs to choose from, so again, keep an eye out on these injuries. It's just that time of year where we generally know who's productive. So the percent roster numbers, they're tougher to work with a show like this. So let's move on to wide receiver. Let's talk about Jaden Reed. Even if Christian Watson goes this week, I like Jaden Reed. My numbers have the Bears as essentially the best slot matchup in the league. You could maybe argue San Francisco's a little bit better, maybe Washington too, but Chicago's right up there. And that's where Jaden Reed lives and eats. Reed saw a 19% target share against the Bears a couple of weeks ago. He was in the slot on 82% of his routes run. He scored 9.3 PPR points, which is fine, but the Packers were also playing at home and had a relatively easier time with their ground game approach. They had a 50% pass rate. They're usually above that. So I think Reed could walk into this game and see 6 or 7 targets, given this matchup. And it's against a team that's allowed the most adjusted wide receiver points to the slot this year. That's what makes Reed a really interesting play. Now, I just mentioned that San Francisco slot matchup. They get the Colts this week. Josh Downs hit double-digit PPR points last week for the first time in a month with Phillip Rivers under center. Alec Pierce was the one who suffered most. Downs had a 19% target share in that game. He ran 81% of his routes out of the slot. With San Francisco's offense likely to move the ball well this week, it wouldn't surprise me if the Colts had to play a little bit more aggressively than they did last week. And that could really allow Downs to be an okay play. After his 28% target share last week, Adonai Mitchell is at a 27% target share per game rate with the Jets. He's seen spiked weeks of 24 and 17 PPR points in 2 of his last 3. The Jets aren't in the greatest spot this week on paper. New Orleans is probably a better matchup than you'd think, though, for Mitchell. Yes, they're bottom 10 in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, but they've been totally average at limiting perimeter wide receivers. It's just that they crush slot wideouts. They've been the best in fantasy points allowed to slot receivers in the entire NFL. Mitchell doesn't play in the slot, so I think he's still an okay play this week. Now, I'm expecting Rome Odunze to be out this week, and right now, at the time of this recording, things are really up in the air with Luther Burden. If Burden goes, you have to like him against Green Bay. I talked all about him on yesterday's 10 Trends episode. If he doesn't go, you could look at Olamide Zaccheaus. Zaccheaus saw a 78% route share for Chicago last week that was second highest on the team, largely because Luther Burden was sidelined. But he would operate as their number 2 wide receiver. It's not a great matchup, but they're at home, Micah Parsons is now out, and the Bears have an okay enough 22.5 point implied team total. And then the last wide receiver in this tier is Jalen Coker. He's seen target shares of 30% and 19% over his last 2 games, scoring 17 and 14 PPR points. The Panthers get that aforementioned pass funnel defense against the Bucs. So we could see more pass attempts, and those peripherals could go a long way against his defense. At tight end, if we do see Luther Burden sidelined, it'll make Colston Loveland an even better play. Loveland has been awesome per route run. He just doesn't always get those routes. But I'd imagine he'd be featured more if they were without Burden and Odunze. Loveland has seen target shares of 19%, 18%, and 19% over his last 3 games. He unfortunately hasn't been up to that 70% route share mark, but that could, again, increase without Burden and Odunze. Green Bay is not the best matchup, but the lack of weapons could really help Loveland out. People are not going to want to hear this, but Isaiah Likely, he's kind of a decent streamer this week. He didn't see a single target last week, but he did see a pretty usual route share for him with a healthy Mark Andrews. He actually ran one more route than Andrews. This game against New England, it sets up as one where Baltimore could throw the ball more than usual. Teams against the Patriots usually see their pass rate rise by 3 percentage points versus their season-long average. And New England's a top 10 matchup for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. So don't be overly surprised if Likely is usable this week. And then lastly, we got to talk about this Rams situation. As long as Davante Adams is out, Colby Parkinson is a top 10 tight end play this week. He's averaged 13.5 PPR points per game over his last 6. He's been used frequently in the red zone. They get Seattle on Thursday night, and the Seahawks are 13th in adjusted target share allowed to tight ends, and they're 8th in adjusted points allowed to the position. But while I'm talking about Parkinson, I don't think we should sleep on Terrence Ferguson. He's more of the quintessential pass-catching tight end. He has that build, he has that athleticism. And he actually ran more routes than Colby Parkinson last week. It wouldn't surprise me at all if the Rams feature Terrence Ferguson more with Davante Adams out. He's more of that 1-to-1 with Adams. So if you really want to play some hero ball in the playoffs, Ferguson is a deep play. With the defensive streamers this week, I've got 3 of them for you. New Orleans is the easy go-to against the Jets. I don't mind Minnesota against the Giants. And then now that Tua is benched, I think Cincinnati's in play against Miami. The Bengals have actually finished as a defense 9, 5, 17, and 10 over their last 4 games. They're not great defensively, but they haven't been quite as bad as they were earlier this year. So those are the 3 defenses this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Given next week's Sleepers episode falls on Christmas Day, this is actually the last Sleeper show of the season. I hope you like the newer format this year, and I really hope it helped you out. I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.
At CVS, it matters that we're not just in your community, but that we're part of it. It matters that we're here for you when you need us, day or night. And we want everyone to feel welcomed and rewarded. It matters that CVS is here to fill your prescriptions and here to fill your craving for a tasty and, healthy snack. At CVS, we're proud to serve your community because we believe where you get your medicine matters. So visit us at cvs.com or just come by our store. We can't wait to meet you. Store hours vary by location.
This is Julian Edelman from Dudes on Dudes with Gronk and Jules. Sunday mornings, I've got my game day ritual. Coffee, Lucky Socks, and now new morning Uncrustable sandwiches.
It's all about that 12-gram protein boost with the new Uncrustables, bright-eyed berry or up and apple flavors.
Bright-eyed berries got a feisty receiver energy.
Up and apple, your classic do-it-all tight end.
Soft, pillowy, packed with protein, and easy enough for Gronk to grab from the freezer.
Whether you're on the couch, driving to the tailgate, or heading to the locker room, new morning Uncrustable sandwiches are the MVP of snacks.
Your new Sunday kickoff ritual starts here with new morning Uncrustable sandwiches packed with 12 grams of protein.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.